Okay, we have the remainder of the faithful here. I've seen many of you here for 2 days, and I just really want to acknowledge that and to thank you. I think it's a real testament to your interest in these issues and your commitment to the work and to understanding. I'm really grateful, and I think I speak for all the organizers, how grateful we are that you would take so much time out of your very busy schedules to join us for this discussion. Which is why I'd like to start by saying that yet again, we would like to end this session very much with input from you. The purpose of this discussion in this last session is to try not necessarily to impose some sort of coherence out of everything that was discussed, because obviously we've covered a lot of ground in the last 2 days, but rather at least to try to find some of the themes that we've heard over the course of the 2 days, and to direct that towards, as I mentioned earlier, a research and a practice agenda, not just for UMass Boston, but for, and I extend this invitation to our many partners and friends who have spoken here as well, for other academic institutions, other NGOs and other practitioners who are interested in moving the ball a little further down the field and trying to improve on the work of interreligious conflict resolution. And so consequently, I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. First, David Smock and Charlie Sennett and I are going to try to sort of seed the ground a little bit by talking a little bit about the themes that we've heard and thinking about the questions that we think we heard need to be asked. And I'm going to try to make some mention of the many points you've made over there on the wall when I speak, although I certainly won't be able to do justice to everything. But as I mentioned, these will appear in the conference summary that we'll put together when this is done. But so to ask you to do 2 things. One is to, as we're speaking, to jot down a key point. If you find yourself saying, yeah, that's it. That's the thing that we should be focusing on. Because when we're finished speaking, we're going to again ask you to sort of speak in small groups. And to give us some guidance and say, of all the many themes and particularly questions that we're raising that need to be addressed, what's the one that strikes you as the most important? To give us some ranking of priority of all the many different good things that we've heard about doing. What is the one thing that you're walking away saying that's something that really needs to be worked on? And that a small but mighty university like UMass Boston and others also here as well should be spending their time and resources focusing on trying to work on. And the same thing with the other organizations here as well, the other NGOs that are working on these same problems. What are the ones we should really be sort of focusing our time on? So think about that as we're speaking, and we're going to turn to you when we're done and ask you to give us some guidance on that. So let me turn over now to David Smock of the U.S. Institute of Peace, who has been with us both days and has been listening to the conversation and give us some thoughts on this. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Darren. Thinking over what has been said and reflecting on it, Bruce Hemmer started us off with a very interesting presentation of what CSO is doing, but I think the most important thing that he indicated was a new attention to religion on the part of the State Department and the U.S. government generally. They've got a very long way to go, but the appointment of Sean Casey in the Office of Religious Engagement is an important initiative. The fact that Jerry White and Rick Barton are leading the CSO, both with histories of involvement with religion. The Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group has been an important innovation of Secretary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. Of course, there's always been the Office of International Religious Freedom. Farah Pandit, who is the special representative to the Muslim community, the representative appointed to the Organization of Islamic Conference. All important initiatives of the last 2 administrations, and I think we hope that this trend will be continued and reinforced in the future, and we'll see what it means for those of us in the field. Another thing that Bruce touched on, but we could do a lot more work on, is the Establishment Clause. He mentioned the difficulty of a project in Bangladesh that they encountered with opposition from the USAID lawyers, and the USAID lawyers are by far the worst on this issue. State Department is much more open and liberal. our institute is that our lawyers look at this. We've had a much more liberal interpretation. We have done much more work that would violate what the USAID lawyers would consider a violation of the Establishment Clause. But a lot more work needs to be done by legal scholars on what are the parameters, what can we do with government funding that is not going to violate the Establishment Clause, but enables us to dig deeply into religious communities, dig deeply into religious thought and convictions in our work, because it's fundamentally important. Probably the most complex and important issue that has been surfaced today, I think Eliza touched on it at several points. But are we talking about religious conflict? What does it mean to have religious conflict? So much of what we talk about as religious conflict isn't religious in character. It's not debates about theology. It's debates about politics. It's a competition for resources, for political power. Eliza also said that religion was the most important identity. Well, it's the most important identity when the multiple identities that people have reinforce each other. When ethnic identity, occupational identity, when class identity, when regional identity all overlap with religious identities. That's when religious identities are so important. When there are multiple identities that are dispersed and don't all overlap with religious identities, then we have a much more complex picture, and religious identity isn't nearly as central. But this whole question of what is religious conflict and what isn't it? I mean, so much, I go back to the fallacy of misplaced concreteness that Whitehead used to talk about. And I fall into this trap too. We talk about Muslim-Christian conflict, when in fact so much of what we're talking about isn't really religious conflict, it's conflict over resources and other factors. In the Nigeria session, there was talk about how to de-radicalize youth, and we need much more work on this. We've had a project recently working with our partner in Nigeria, the Clean Foundation, to talk about what is the appeal of Boko Haram to young men, Muslim men in the north. And the report that came out 2 weeks ago in Nigeria, we will have a summary that we will produce probably in the next couple of months. The appeal of Boko Haram. What is it that makes people attracted to join a group that is engaged in the killing field in northern Nigeria and has a warped interpretation of Islam that seems to motivate it, along with so many other factors that are motivators? But how do you understand the appeal of radical movements, and how do you de-radicalize youth? And I know Charles will talk about narrative, but it's so critically important. The power of the DVD on the imam and pastor is primarily the power of the narrative of the imam and pastor and their story about how they became peacemakers. We've taken that DVD to places around the world, including Iraq. It's had such a powerful impact in Iraq, dubbed in Arabic, and it's the narrative. It's the narrative of the imam and the pastor that have been powerful in Iraq and so many other places where the DVD is shown and where people become acquainted with the story of the imam and the pastor. And Dave Joseph talked about the narrative, the importance of narrative, and the religious peacemakers in action that the Tannenbaum Center has lifted up. Again, it's the stories of these religious peacemakers that is so powerful. In the Nigeria session, there wasn't much mention of Boko Haram, and yet Boko Haram is threatening the stability of the Nigerian state at its roots, and how to counter Boko Haram is still an unsolved mystery in Nigeria and elsewhere, and more work could be done on it. At various points in the discussion, people have touched upon the role of technology, but we need much more work on the role of social media, on the role of technology in promoting religious peace building. Farah Panda touched on it. We talked about the early warning system in Nigeria that use social media, but we're really behind the times. We're not up to speed in terms of technology and the use of social media in our field. We're just beginning to grab the importance of it. I was struck personally by the various involvements of UMass Boston in practical projects on the ground. There was no mention in the talk in the Nevi Shalom panel about the university that UMass and Nevi Shalom are setting up in Israel based on Nevi Shalom, working with IMC in Nigeria, the Bridges Project, all innovative engagements, academic engagement in utilizing the tools for practical outcomes, practice. I would applaud UMass Boston for these initiatives. It's really quite extraordinary. Nava Sonnenschein lifted up for us an important part of their work on the asymmetries of power. And our institute has picked up on this and learned it from Nevi Shalom. But it's such an important understanding in all of our relationships, bringing communities together to understand who has the upper hand and what are the symbols of that upper hand. She was talking about the selection of the languages to be used in dialogue and making sure that Hebrew is not the exclusive language used in these dialogues, even though the participants on both sides understand Hebrew, because it's a symbol of the dominance of the Israeli Jewish side. And the importance of intra-community dialogue and understanding. Nava also talking about their work bringing together Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews to talk about their differences. And we've engaged in supporting a project in Israel, bringing together radical Jews with more settlers, with more moderate and secular Jews to talk about their differences and their perspectives on the peace process. And to have dialogue intra-community, and the pastor and imam have been particularly effective in bringing together, when they bring together Christians and Muslims, to start by talking to Christians as a community, the pastor talking to Christians, and the imam talking to Muslims as communities to talk about their differences before we bring the two communities together to talk about their differences. It's a very powerful approach and strategy. I think Chris Taylor lifted up for us the importance of bringing together practitioners from the field to talk to each other and to train each other, not to bring Western trainers as the exclusive possessors of the knowledge and the techniques for religious peace building, but to work with partners in zones of conflict and with practitioners in zones of conflict. And also Chris talked about the follow-up work that is being done among the participants using email to keep them in touch with each other. And this is a very important part of any training program, to enable the participants to engage in dialogue after they've separated from each other. And we had various questions about the role of women and the neglect of women as religious peace builders. This is something our institute has worked on. We have a book that will be coming out later this year on women as religious peace builders, but also whether there are differences between men and women in their approaches to peace building and their overall interests in religious peacemaking. Joyce Levinsky talked about the fact that so little of their work has been evaluated, and this is true of so much of our work. We're not strong in evaluation, and we haven't given enough attention to rigorous evaluation of the effectiveness of our work. We think it's just intuitively obvious what the positive outcomes of our work is, or what our failures are, but we need rigorous evaluations to assess this. And another thing we need to think about more deeply is the extent to which we involve religious content when we're involved in interfaith dialogues and interchanges. How much should we cite scriptures of the two communities? How much attention should we give to prayer? How much attention to rituals? Are these unifying forces, or are they divisive forces in dialogue situations? I think we can try to learn from each other's experience with this. We had discussions about forgiveness, so centrally important and so hard to understand. Forgiveness can be so fundamentally misunderstood. There can be talk about cheap forgiveness as if we're expecting people to forget the atrocities that have been committed against them. That's not true forgiveness. We don't want people to forget what has happened to them, but we want people to put it in a different context and to begin to think about how they can become reconciled with those that have been the perpetrators of the conflict, and what are the techniques that can be used to promote forgiveness. And in Doug Johnston's presentation this morning, he talked about Track 1 and Track 2 in Kashmir and how frustrated he was that they weren't able to have the Track 2 efforts that they engaged in Kashmir to be translated into effectiveness at the Track 1 level. And this is a continuing issue for peacemaking generally, and those of us who promote a lot of Track 2 activity, is how can we link more effectively our work with Track 2 and have an impact on Track 1, and get Track 1 practitioners to appreciate more fundamentally the value of Track 2 and what Track 1 can learn from Track 2, and how Track 2 practitioners can learn how to link up with Track 1. Just peacemaking was talked about this morning as well, and our institute has worked with Susan Thistlethwaite and her work, and we financed a lot of the work that she's done. But so much more can be done in elucidating what just peacemaking means. I had a graduate student come to me the other day and ask about whether just peacemaking is being talked about in the halls of the State Department and in Congress, and I thought, how naive. We've got such a long way to go to carry these messages about just peacemaking and other concepts in our field into the world of the policymakers. Restorative justice, another field that needs more attention and work. And finally, it was mentioned this morning, I think Charles mentioned it, about the flow of resources from this country, from Saudi Arabia, to fund fundamentalist movements in different zones of conflict. We don't know much about this. This is something to track the money. And beyond just the Saudis and the Americans, what other sources are that are funding radical movements and divisive movements around the world? Thinking about Boko Haram, I've often been puzzled. Where do they get their money? Where do they get their weapons? I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are members of Boko Haram, and hundreds have been killed, and yet more come forward and more money is spent and more weapons are available. So those are just some of the ideas that I've had from listening to the discussion in the last 2 days.
Thanks, David. That was such a precise and accurate rundown, I think, of the issues that we accomplished here. I wanted to step back a little bit and go more macro. And I wanted to do that by starting with just talking about community. One of the first things I heard in this conference was that this is a community. And I think this is a community that binds together with a belief that religion can be a bridge over religious divides. Global community is so important, you know, and the person here who really embodies the way this is global is our esteemed guest, Imam Ashafa, who's here to tell us that this community that is being convened by UMass Boston is a global community, and you're part of it. I think it's also locally important to recognize that places like Bridges, Boston, and so many of the other groups that are here are the real local binding of this community. And I want to just stress that this community believes conflict resolution leads to human security and effective global governance. That's the business of the McCormick School. And I think it's it's worth stopping and just recognizing that the community aspect that is here is incredibly important. You may have heard me applaud a little bit loud when David mentioned UMass Boston and the amazing work that's being done here. That's because I am an alum of the University of Massachusetts, and very proudly so, in a town with some pretty big universities across the river and down the road and all around this institution. It can often be easy to overlook the incredible accomplishments of this place, the work that all of you do here as PhD students or as professors. I feel really lucky to have seen some of that work in the field and to watch Darren. You know, it's unusual, it's very unusual for two journalists to agree on the same thing. And for Eliza, who's a great colleague of mine, and myself, I don't know if you picked up on this, we both said that we've reported on conflict around the world, and we both said independently, no notes shared, no conversations beforehand, that the most effective conflict resolution we've ever seen, collectively we'd probably have about a half-century of reporting, is the Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna. I hope that really resonates here. I know how hard Darren is working with that. I'm telling you, I am like very cynical, but I really saw how effective that is, and this community should be proud of that. I think that this community came together here with a shared understanding that we need to respect and understand the role that religious traditions can play and need to play in resolving conflict. The media, as Eliza pointed out very well, can be very cynical about religion. It can be very dismissive of religion. It can, in fact, be very contemptuous of religion. And that's dangerous because the world is moving to a music that is religion in many ways. And if journalists don't have an ear for that music, they're not going to understand the world. So I deeply believe in stopping for a minute as journalists and saying, we need to hear that. I think the same may be true in academia. I'm not sure there isn't a similar cynicism or distance from religion, a distrust of religion, a sense that that's not really what matters. If we in the media or you in academia are going to effectively convene these kinds of gatherings, we're going to have a really good ear for that music that's moving the world. So I think that's something to take away. Three things I would say this community can take from this. Listen, act, and tell. And I'm briefly going to go through what I mean by that. I think we need to listen to the wisdom of the voices in here, the voices of religious leaders and those who understand religion. You know, we know that the more secular practitioners sometimes grow uncomfortable with that, and they need, of course, to be a big part of this, but we have to do a better job of listening to religious leadership and finding the right parties, finding the right people who we bring in. We have to do a better job deepening our understanding of the differences between and within these religious divides. So that's listen. We need to act. We need to take the ideas here beyond the conference and act on them. There was this great praise, as I shared, with the Interfaith Mediation Center. There's so much more to be done. I love the way Eliza drew on the example of the cook stoves and the really practical community work that's being done. The way the people from Bridges Boston talked about some very practical on-the-ground things being done. I think there's a lot more of that very practical work to be done, and I, for one, am throwing my hand up as a member of the media, as someone who'd love to be involved in that. So if you have things you need action on, please keep me in your circle, and I would love to be in touch with you. The last one is tell. Tell the narratives. The narratives shared here need to be shared much more widely around the world. As I shared with Imam Ashafa, his story is so powerful. I want him to go to the West Bank and to Gaza and tell that story. I want him to go to Jerusalem and tell that story, because it's a story that can empower others. This is the whole work of Porag O'Malley, who convened that wonderful conference in Kaduna. And the central idea behind that conference, which if you remember, brought together people who had been in different sides of conflicts in Lebanon, in Belfast, in Derry, in Mitrovica, and around the world. Porig's entire body of work is to say that telling the narrative, sharing the stories, empowers people to work through conflict resolution. And I think that's more than just storytelling. That's really teaching each other how to get through this. You've all heard Porig tell the story, or if you haven't, then I hope you're lucky enough to someday, about how when he brought the people from Northern Ireland to South Africa, where they heard Nelson Mandela tell them basically to get over themselves and to stop this ridiculous divide in Northern Ireland. And as Mandela put it, if we can do it, certainly you can. Those stories matter. There are a lot of narratives here that can empower people. Tannenbaum Center, amazing narratives of peacemakers in action. All of you have these individual stories. Keep telling them, you know, this is my craft, this is my passion, and this is my business, storytelling. That's what I do. Global Post is a storytelling machine. We want your stories. When you have something important, think about writing an op-ed for us. We'd love to publish it. We want to know incredible stories. When Darren began to tell me about the pastor and the imam, I sort of, thought, okay, that's a cute little story. And then I went out and heard this narrative. That is maybe one of the most powerful stories I've heard in 30 years of journalism. That's a great story. So I invite you to come and give us your stories. Let us help you share them if you need help that way. And I just want to say I was really proud to be part of this community today, and I want to thank Ira for inviting me and for convening it. Thanks, Ira. Darren?
Okay. My thanks to my colleagues. It's always difficult coming third. I'll try not to be too redundant on some of the themes I've heard today. And as I mentioned, I'll also try to weave in some of the ones that are here along the wall that I hope you had a chance to take a little bit closer look at. Let me just quickly, on the last point Charlie made about narratives, and we've heard a lot about Imam Ashafa and Pastor James's model. I just wanted to flag for you both, there is an important story. Oh, thank you. An important story that Charlie and his colleagues at Global Post have done on the Global Post website. And then second, as Charles has just reminded me, is that we have Charles, he's over there, you might want to raise your hand, who was involved in putting. A documentary called The Imam and the Pastor about their story. So these are both out there and important pieces if you want to learn more. I think I'm going to mention a few things that I said yesterday as well, just as a reminder. I think we've heard quite a bit about this question, and many of you raised it over here as well, that Eliza talked about it. Is it religion or is it not? And I think I just really, in this conversation, David, I think, covered that very well. I just want to point out, I think David Steele's very important intercession on that point about the fit between these. I think that where do the causal arrows go is an ongoing question, but I think the fit among these different pieces of, is it resources? Is it about land? Is it religion? It's obviously all of these things are interacting. So this fit question is an important one we could perhaps spend more time on. I want to remind you as well of General Dambazo's point yesterday about this need for accreditation in Nigeria, which I think underlying this very important question of the relationship between the state and religion. In some instances like Nigeria, the fact that the state has stepped back so much from this is seen as a problem, yet in other states, as Bruce talked about yesterday with Uzbekistan, where the state is far more engaged and completely controlling of religion, is also too far. So this difficult relationship of the state and religion, where is the happy medium in terms of this accreditation or not, an important question that might need some work. I mentioned as well yesterday on the point about politicization of religion. This is something that many of you in your small group discussions talked about as well, and I think there are a lot of really interesting questions up there to that effect. And I had raised the question yesterday that I'd like to mention again about the bipolarity problem, is this move towards seeing that it's one or the other. It's either Islam or Christianity. It's either Israeli or Palestinian. I think on the 20th anniversary of the genocide, it's obviously important to remember, is it Hutu or Tutsi? An excellent example of hyper-polarization and bipolarization and how deadly that can be, and seeing that as an important warning sign. But I think that this also brings up the conversation today we talked about the intra-religious dynamics that many of you raised over here in your small group discussion. We heard Eliza talk about it as well in her keynote, is, I didn't write down who, someone talking about calling religion back to its roots, in the sense that in many ways part of maybe what we need to think about is muddying the waters, is the fact that to see things in bipolar terms as us or them and the simple binary framework, to just remind religions themselves of their own diversity, their own history, is something that perhaps can be supported by a research initiative and by further practice. Is that something that we should be focusing our time on trying to muddy the waters of a seemingly clear picture? We also mentioned yesterday from Bridges learning about the importance of this process of communication between civil society groups and the state. Eliza again also echoed that theme today as well, the importance of civil society and how Bridges creates that opportunity. I think, though, we heard from Rodney Peterson today talking about restorative justice. And I think that's another interesting question here that we did not get to talk about at length. But there is an entire restorative justice movement in the United States and other countries that is trying to bring more mediated outcomes into the criminal justice system. There seems to be some obvious roles for the religious community in that conversation. They're already there. Is there more that could be done? And is there something that, in terms of research agenda, we need to be thinking in that regard? And then I also, want to mention the question raised yesterday about bringing the community along. I think Fatima said this. So how do we bring the community along in these sorts of processes? I think this touches on some of the track 1, track 2 issues that David spoke about. But also, Doug in his conversation talked about this dilemma of track 1.5 of the need to reach further down into the communities. Andrea echoed the points about the need to surface power relationships we heard yesterday. I don't think we need to talk about that again. We also heard a lot about youth, and I think a lot of the questions you raised over here are very important, of engaging youth in these processes. I'd like to mention again the point I mentioned yesterday about the scaling up problem. I think this is the flip side of the track 1, track 2 debate, in the sense that many of us are working very hyper-local. Is there better ways that we can try to transfer the impact of these local impacts to the national level? And I think we heard quite a bit of important, advice about that. Is there more we should be looking into in that regard? And again, I think in many of your questions on the wall, and many others, David mentioned this as well, is the importance of better research on the relationship of women and peacemaking and religion. And there are obvious sort of structural impediments and the role of patriarchy in many of the religions of the world, yet at the same time the obvious importance of engaging more women into peace processes. Eliza talked about how IMC has had some important successes in trying to engage women peacemakers in the work that it's done, and they are not singular in that regard, but clearly much more needs to be done. But yet, as peacemakers, engaging in that debate gets us into a debate that is very fundamental within religions themselves right now about the role of women. So there's an inherent tension there that peacemakers who tend to want to take things just as they are rather than as they should be, having to deal with a deep sort of normative debate happening in religions themselves right now. Greater publicity of common Christian and Muslim values. Jerome mentioned in conversation about an important publication called A Common Word. that came out several years ago that did exactly what Imam Ashafa and Pastor James have talked about in terms of finding common verses between the Bible and the Quran and finding a lot of common ground there. A lot more could be done to just be to simply publicizing that sort of work. It's in the little picture in a lot of different places. It would be very interesting to get more of that into the bigger picture. I think Joyce made a very important point about the lack of evaluation in the field. And I think that's something as academic institutions is our forte. And I think that that would be something we could be thinking about. Can we spend more time thinking about, better evaluation in the field? And then I think Joyce also mentioned, and Charlie's comments here really get to the importance of getting the story out. But I wanted to underscore what Andrea said about the importance of the story being framed in terms of helping people understand that it's possible, and that in the deep sort of sense of lack of hope in many of the circumstances that we're working, and it's not just abroad, but here in the United States, a sense of hopelessness in many communities. These sorts of stories tell people, yes, indeed, it is possible to cross that divide. And I think it's important as well in telling those stories, there are the incredible stories like Imam Ashafa and Pastor James, but we also, I think, need to hear the stories where fit very much like an everyday basis, where those of us who maybe have not been engaged in militias and have not tried to kill somebody from the other religion, but still there are heroic efforts to cross religious divides in local communities on a regular basis. There must be some stories there as well that can inspire those of us too who are not as incredible in that sense. Vocational training of religious peacemakers, something that Joyce mentioned, the importance of this, and as well as employment for folks in that regard. I think that's a really, really interesting piece. I think we tend to see this as something that comes out organically in the field. Why can't we train religious peacemakers? And many of us are trying to do exactly that. In fact, I think most of us here are trying to do exactly that. But I think that we need to at least change the sense that that is not an abnormal thing to do, but it should be a fundamental part of curricula, and that could be something that could be discussed. I think Joyce had another really important point about testing the transferability of these models. I think we heard very importantly how Pastor James and Imam Ashafa went to Iraq, for instance, where their story was very well accepted. But there's stories as well, for instance, of Nelson Mandela offering to mediate between Israelis and Palestinians about 10, 15 years ago, and being said, no, thank you. So not every model is necessarily, and not every great person is going to be able to work in every conflict around the world. That's something perhaps as academics we can help out with, of thinking about the transferability of these models. Where do they fit best, and where can we recommend individuals like James and Ashafa who do great works, where should they be going outside of Nigeria at some point? Where are the best places where their models might fit in other circumstances? A lot was said about forgiveness and telling our own history. I think I've mentioned that already. Many of you were very interested and raised the issue of mental illness and religious conflict. That was something we didn't get a chance to talk much about in this, but clearly there's a psychology to religious violence that needs more thought. Is that something that needs some work? Let me just, and lastly, I think to end on Eliza's charge to us of looking at the relationship between environment and religion. And I think this is something with our own program and expertise on environment here for UMass Boston is something we need to think very, very deeply about. And I think that this cuts two ways, is that clearly religious extremists have their own way and are trying to frame the debate on climate change in Africa and other places and why these things are happening. But mainstream religion, there has long been the message of stewardship of the earth. That comes through religion. And I think this is still very early on in the debate out there, and good research might be able to help set that policy discussion and maybe even help to influence some of the narratives that we've been talking about as well about religion and conflict. Okay, so we've set out just a few things of themes and questions to hear. Obviously, as I said before, we can't cover everything. And it's not just, again, for UMass Boston. I think for all our many partners here who are doing amazing work around the world and right at home as well. I think we would all be grateful for a little bit of guidance from you all. You've heard a lot the last couple of days. Again, I'd like to ask you, what would you say is of the many things, if you could focus a research project, not maybe UMass, maybe any of the other folks that are engaged here, on one of the key questions that you've heard today, or key subjects, what would that be? Okay, if you could pick one. So what I'd like to ask you to do is maybe folks who are just clustered in twos or threes, maybe move over to a little bit of bigger tables. But I'd like to ask you, in the tables and circles you're at right now, let's spend 10 minutes, and if you could come up together with a recommendation, and then I'm going to ask, in the final minutes, to ask you to go around and to get those recommendations from you. Okay? So take about 7 to 10 minutes if you could, and then we'll come back and we'll finish up. Thank you. Okay. Again, I just want to thank you all. You've done some hard work this conference, in addition to staying with it for 2 days, but I also really greatly appreciate the comments that you've given us, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you right now. And again, no initiative, either an academic or a practitioner, needs to be focused on just one thing. But I've asked you to come up with just one, because obviously many of you are going to see things very differently. And out of the one result of this conversation can give us some priorities on where we should be focusing on. So if I may, I'd like to start with Ben's table as our host.
All right.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Brian Green of the Institution of Ben Slomoff's family. And I'm also a primary care doctor not very far away, just across the river. And I guess one of the things that we talked about at our table is something that Eliza brought up about to be in the Central African Republic doesn't necessarily mean anything just as a citizen of a state that doesn't provide any services. And in that kind of a vacuum, the religious identity becomes a far more prominent identity. Whereas in the United States, there is some notion of a state-driven religion in some sense. We have a polytheism as part of the way we envision ourselves. And to what extent, in a country like China, where the state is the religion, North Korea, the state is religion, at what level that suppresses religious conflict, and what benefit there is of empowering the state or enforcing the state for ameliorating these types of conflicts.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. So the very important state relationship question, and that in itself unpacks a number of questions, as you mentioned. Thank you. Joyce, may I turn to your table next? Okay. And please do introduce yourself.
I'm Charlie Munitz, and I've been an academic from time to time, president of a synagogue, and involved at various points in different kinds of conflict resolution. So we talked about a number of different things here, trying to determine what effective techniques are and how to test those, and then figuring out about funding and putting some kind of resources behind those was one of the concerns. And then thinking about who should fund those, and we discussed some of the liabilities about the government being behind things, but recognized that someone needs to be behind things. And we also talked about the significance of the issue of women and the need to focus on that, and especially in light of the story about, was it Eliza's story about the women getting together and sort of achieving some kind of common ground that sort of religious discourse did not achieve was a kind of signal of an important angle which we needed to look at more closely.
Thank you. Thank you. May I turn to Jane, Rodney, your table? Would someone from your table like to talk about what the priority question was?
David Steele. We really talked about the intersection between indigenous practices, many of which are religious in various parts of the world, with us who come from the West and the more Western orientation, looking at what kind of creative possibilities are there, not only in a Western indigenous conversation as though it's just a two-way, back and forth important, but among indigenous practices there are differences. Different approaches, sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there's conflict actually, in my experience. So how do you bring about that conversation that includes a multitude of indigenous practices, many of which have a religious orientation, if not basis to them, along with us who come from the West, so that everybody learns? That's a basic question.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go back to Imam Ashafa and Charles's table back there. Would someone like to? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we came up with...
Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm Liz Lee Hood, a graduate student in the study of religion at Harvard University, doing
Thank you.
Islamic studies and seeing this as an applied aspect of my studies. So we came up with developing pedagogy of peace and compassionate education based on best practices learned by people around the world who are doing it on the ground, and mainstreaming it in public education and religious communities.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for public education. Okay, thank you. We'll turn now to, I see Dave Joseph and Bruce Hemmer at your table there. Would you like to?
What we talked about was kind of the difficulty of boiling this down to actionable research questions that are, going to be useful across different contexts. Because to the degree that we have evaluation of what works in this field, it tends to be very particularized. In accordance with the nature of the work itself, needs to be very particularized to how religions manifest in particular cultures and particular political dynamics. That's why it's difficult to take one of these questions and make it into this general global question that's actually going to be easily researched.
I warned it was unsatisfying.
But one thing we talked about was the potential of meta-evaluation, of taking a bunch of small project evaluations that have some sort of similar elements and looking at what works across those as one particular approach that might work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Shall we go back here? Yeah? And come forward.
Hi, my name is Jeet Namas. I'm an alumni of the program. So our table was a bit dispersed. We all came up from our own angles, and we started with a question of how do we change world relations among governments to have them focus more on peace education and global governance versus defense in a way that's reflected in their budget. And then we also discussed technology and social media, and then we also discussed religions and the problems are within religions. That's something that really impacted one of our members. And in the end, the underlying stream that we could find among all of those was reflected very precisely by something you said. It was how do we view the future versus the present? And the underlying theme of that is youth, and how do not only we change our perspectives from youth in the ground, within religions, and how to train them in the places of conflict, but also how do we have within our universities programs that maybe have more compulsory training? Is that what you, yeah. And yes, so that was our main idea. How do you educate youth so that we thought about it in a long-term kind of way, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. To this table, Al Lincoln and your colleagues here, do you want to? Thank you.
Muhammad Tariq from University of the Punjab, Pakistan, doctoral scholar. Sir, if we pay others equal chances to live, that either the religion and sect one has been belonging to be, and for the same very reason, media should be involved and intervened, and government policies of the governments, the sitting governments, they should evolve such alike.
Okay, can you repeat the last part one more time?
The media should be involved and intervene for the same reason that people should be given equal chances to live and so like.
Okay. Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And now, last but not least, please.
Sorry, Yoga, I had to step in for the group. We had a little conversation about technology, which I dominated, unfortunately. But it stems from this question that was asked about, specifically about the role of technology and social media in religious conflict violence prevention. And we would like to caution anyone who thinks about technology as a cure-all, that technology can, somehow cure all problems related to religious conflict. Having said that, there is definitely a role that technology can play, and our understanding is that if the technology is developed by and for global communities who are experiencing religious conflict, I think that has a better chance of success rather than technology that's developed in global capitals by, large technology enterprises.
Okay, thank you. Did I miss anyone in the conversation? No? Nope. Okay, well, congratulations. You've all said something different. So, but this is not the end of the conversation, although I certainly heard some common themes around the state. I think there was quite a bit of interest around that issue, but several others that certainly go together well. We are going to take these comments that you've given us, in addition to the ones here, and we are going to reflect on these, and this is not over. You're not getting away that easily. We are going to feed this back to you and continue to ask for your input. And for my fellow presenters in particular, I want to say a big thank you for having joined us in this, and that we plan to stay in touch with you as well. And we're very interested in working on these issues because they're huge, and no one of us can take care of them alone. And as Charlie made the important point about a community, I think this is a community that's already existed, and I think our program in particular wants to join up. And we're grateful for those of you who have been doing this work for a long time in what I certainly feel is a welcome with open arms for more hands on deck to help wrestle with many of these issues, to think more deeply about these topics, and to try to move practice forward. And I promise you we will be in touch, and we're going to stay on these things. And we're going to be producing a number of reports and some smaller op-ed length pieces as well from this. So stay tuned for that, in addition to the larger research agenda, which we'll be back with you on as well. And that's going to take a little bit longer time to develop. But we're committed to this, and we're very grateful. The last bit of work I have to ask you to join me with is to help me with some thank yous. Just as I said yesterday, there have been folks who have really put it all out in bringing this together, and it would not have been a success without them. If I can start this time with our student volunteers. Would you stand up? Where's our... Thank you. Speaking of the next generation, since I'm in my mid-40s, one of the benefits of being there is that you can see both ends of the road, the ends and the beginnings, and so it's a vantage point, and it's a real honor to be working with folks like this, who you can already see are going to do far more than I've already done already, and I'm looking forward to going down toward the end of the road and watching them surpass the many things that we've tried to do. Let me thank as well Lee Murphy. Lee, thank you. Lee has managed so many of the logistics. Thank you. Ronnie Lipton, our Associate Director. Did Shauna join us today? Is she here? She's probably doing some work somewhere. Thanks to Shauna out there. Vanessa DiCarlo, thank you. Let me think, where's Modupe? She ran out again. Okay, I missed her yesterday, I missed her again today. Thanks to Modupe. Rochelle Brown, Rochelle, she's working as well. Thanks to Rochelle. Evrim, is Evrim still here? Yeah, she's out too, okay. Charlotte's in class. See, they're doing what they should be doing. I'd like to thank as well, of course, our Chancellor, whose comments last night I think were certainly energizing after a long day. And I'd like to thank our Dean, Ira Jackson. Is Ira still here? He had to head out. Without Ira, none of this would have been possible. And most importantly, Modupe, thanks to you. You were back in time. Modupe was one of the leaders of our student volunteers and helped to bring these things together. And last and most importantly, I'd like to thank Ben and the entire Slomoff family, without whom really none of this would be possible. And to thank you as well, Ben, especially for your inspiration, which you've heard a lot about over the last 2 days, and you continue to inspire us. And having met the rest of the family, I can see that it's going to be a family tradition of inspirational folks. So thank you so much for all you've done for the program. And I think we need to mention as well that in your honor, we've had a number of other alumni who have given to bring this event about, and we need to thank those alums as well. So thanks for inspiring our alums as well, and thanks to those folks who helped bring this event together. Thank you. Let me hand over now to Eben to close up the symposium.
Well, it has been an extraordinary 2 days. I think a tremendous amount of very rich conversation has gone on. I think one of the things that was very gratifying in the last panel with David and Darren and Charlie wrapping up and extracting from the 2 days of conversation both important themes and the goal we had all along, key questions that we need to focus on. And I'm not going to bang on them more, but we got a list of stuff to work on, and I think it's really important. I think that we have successfully set an agenda in this field, and it's now our job to figure out how to pull that together and put it out and get people mobilized in that direction. But I think that in that respect, this is an enormous success. I'll reiterate all of Darren's thank yous. I'll add a thank you to David Matz, did he slip out? Oh, there he is. To David Matz for starting the whole thing by creating the dispute resolution programs here back in 1986. And leading this enterprise so ably for so long. And as we work to develop and design this whole thing and pull it all together, the intellectual lead all along was really my buddy Darren Q. So thank you, Darren. Thank you all for coming. Stay in touch. We'll be in touch. Take care.